Arrington called it the dawn of a golden age. He blamed the prior administration for everything from gas prices to a nuclear Iran. The Treasury Secretary just nodded along. Watch the exchange first, then we'll step back for the full analysis at the end.
Apparently my colleagues had a sudden interest in the rule of law. I wonder if you asked her if she thought illegal immigrants should be detained and deported or caught and released, what the answer would be.
Well, and Congressman, and two, on inflation, I am not going to take firefighting advice from an arsonist.
Well, Mr. Secretary,
they torch the American people.
Mr. Secretary, maybe we ought to ask the question,
inflation.
should the sons of presidents who have multiple felony convictions, should they be held to the same standard of the American people in terms of crime and punishment? I wonder what the answer to that question would be. Let's not veer off. Apparently, wages and take-home pay aren't the only thing up in this country. Irony and hypocrisy is at an all-time high among my Democrat colleagues.
Now we see why someone leaves California every 2 minutes.
And that hypocrisy and irony starts with questions about price increases. It was the failed economic policies, one self-inflicted failed economic policy after the other, that created the worst inflation crisis in a half a century. Unbridled spending, if you add the hikes in interest rates, it would be about $12 trillion in deficit spending. Waiving work requirement for able-bodied adults on welfare, giving welfare and health care to illegal immigrants with the stroke of a pen by President Biden, layers of taxes on American competitiveness, layers of regulation on our small businesses. And you know what? We pay a premium right now, and we will temporarily, to defend our country, our children's future against a nuclear Iran, against a radical terrorist regime where we are under imminent threat. We will pay a premium at the pump. But gas prices were at a low, 2-decade low in terms of disposable income. We had gas prices before the conflict below $3. President Biden and 4 years of Democrat policies, gas prices went from $3.30 to $5. Now, we pay a premium for national security in times of conflict, and when we have imminent threat, we're trying to stave off another addition, nuclear power to the axis of evil. But the premium that the Democrat policies imposed on the American people was for what? A mandate for electric vehicles? What did we get for that premium? We got hundreds of billions of dollars. It was supposed to be 200 billion. 800 plus billions of dollars in giveaways, corporate subsidies for green energy. That's what the American people got. You know, they got higher energy prices, higher electric bills because of this radical climate agenda, the Green New Disaster, and that was the trade-off from my Democrat colleagues. So a little context to this conversation, I think, is helpful. The results, as you know, Mr. Secretary, were that the American people every year were losing $3,000 in wages, that they had a 21% regressive tax hike, 21%. They were losing $1,500 a year. I mean, are we in the golden age? Well, relative to the dark ages that we were thrust in by these failed policies, we are at the dawn of a golden age because wages are up, take-home pay is up, GDP, you said, is 2.6%. Well, that's a percent over what CBO said after we passed the big, beautiful bill. And on an annual average basis in a budget window, that's $3 trillion to reducing the deficit, which may be why the deficit was reduced over 10% in the first 6 months of this fiscal year compared to last fiscal year, because we actually controlled discretionary spending and have saved up to now almost $500 billion. It's because Republicans actually cared about not frittering away tax dollars, and we rooted out waste, fraud, and abuse to a tune of over $1 trillion because we had quadruple revenue from having restructured World Trade Order and set a level playing field for our farmers and manufacturers. Because of all of that plus the growth, We have had a reduction in the deficit to GDP for the first time in almost a decade. I'm out of time. I think you're doing a great job. Keep it up. Don't listen to the noise.
No, I don't, sir. Look, they don't want to talk about how they voted to cut the child tax credit in half for 40 million people, voted for higher rates on low and middle income families, for a $5 trillion tax hike. And if I were the Democrats, this side of the aisle, I would be terrified how many Americans applied for no tax on tips, no tax on overtime, reduced taxes on Social Security, and deductibility of auto loans.
7.5 million no tax on tips, 29 million overtime, seniors 35 million.
Mr. Arrington, your time has expired.
Unbelievable. Keep up the good work, Mr. Secretary.
Thank you.
What made this 5-minute exchange travel was not the policy content. It was the rhetorical performance. Representative Jodey Arrington of Texas used his entire allotment on the Ways and Means Committee to deliver a sustained attack on his colleagues across the aisle, defend the Treasury Secretary, and offer a series of factual claims about the economy. Some of those claims line up with the public record, some do not, and the rhetorical posture, more than the policy substance, is what made the clip move. Arrington opened with a sneer. "Apparently my colleagues had a sudden interest in the rule of law," he said. The line was directed at a prior Democratic line of questioning about an immigration enforcement matter. He pivoted immediately to a hypothetical. "I wonder if you asked her if she thought illegal immigrants should be detained and deported or caught and released, what the answer would be." The maneuver is familiar. Rather than engage the policy question on its merits, redirect the audience to a different question on which the other side is presumed to be unpopular. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent supplied the first viral phrase. "On inflation, I am not going to take firefighting advice from an arsonist," he said. The line is structured to be quoted. It compresses a contested macro argument into a one-sentence accusation. The implicit claim is that the prior administration caused the inflation surge and therefore has no standing to question current policy. Whether the cause was prior administration spending, supply chain disruption, energy markets, or a combination depends on which economists you ask. The line is rhetoric, not analysis. Arrington's response to the rule of law framing was a familiar deflection. Should the sons of presidents who have multiple felony convictions be held to the same standard as the American people in terms of crime and punishment, he asked. The reference is to Hunter Biden, who was convicted on federal firearms and tax charges and subsequently pardoned by his father. The deflection answers a question about constituent policy with a counter-accusation about the prior president's family. It does not engage the substance of the question that prompted it. "Now we see why someone leaves California every 2 minutes, Arrington said. The line is a familiar conservative talking point about California migration. The underlying data is more complicated. California has experienced net domestic outmigration for years, but the state also continues to gain population through international migration and births. The most recent state population estimates show the net change is much smaller than the every 2 minutes framing suggests. The line is shorthand for a political narrative, not a precise demographic claim." Arrington then made his macro case. It was the failed economic policies, one self-inflicted failed economic policy after the other, that created the worst inflation crisis in a half a century. The framing places the inflation surge of 2021 through 2023 squarely on prior administration policy. Mainstream economic analysis attributes the surge to a combination of pandemic supply chain disruption, energy market shocks, and fiscal expansion across both administrations. The single-cause framing is rhetorically clean, but does not match the multi-cause consensus in the macro literature. "Unbridled spending," Arrington said. "If you add the hikes in interest rates, it would be about $12 trillion in deficit spending. The 12 trillion number is in the range that the Congressional Budget Office has used in its long-term deficit projections. What the figure does not capture is what produced it. The largest single drivers of the cumulative deficit during the prior administration were the pandemic response, the resulting revenue collapse, and the interest payments on debt already issued. A figure without its decomposition is not analysis. It is a number used as a flag." Arrington then offered one of the speech's most interesting rhetorical moves. "We pay a premium right now, and we will temporarily to defend our country, our children's future, against a nuclear Iran, against a radical terrorist regime where we are under imminent threat. We will pay a premium at the pump. The framing repositions any current gas price increase as a patriotic cost of a national security posture. It is a clean rhetorical move. It is also testable. Energy market analysts can trace what portion of current pump prices reflects Iran-related premiums versus other supply and demand factors. The framing presumes the answer. Arrington offered a specific price trajectory. Before the conflict, gas prices were below $3. President Biden and 4 years of Democrat policies, gas prices went from $3.30 to $5. The national average gas price did peak above $5 briefly in mid-2022, primarily because of the early phase of the Russia-Ukraine war and associated crude oil disruption. By the end of the prior administration, the national average had returned to a range closer to $3 and change. The 4 years of Democrat policies framing collapses a complex global commodity story into a single domestic causation. What did we get for that premium? Arrington asked. We got hundreds of billions of dollars. It was supposed to be billion plus billions of dollars in giveaways, corporate subsidies for green energy. The framing recasts the Inflation Reduction Act's clean energy provisions as giveaways. The actual structure of the legislation was a combination of investment tax credits, production tax credits, and direct subsidies, with the bulk flowing to private sector companies in Republican-leaning manufacturing districts. Whether those flows are giveaways or industrial policy is a political question. The numbers are the numbers. Arrington then put a household number on the inflation claim. The American people every year were losing $3,000 in wages, he said. They had a 21% regressive tax hike. They were losing $1,500 a year. The $3,000 figure is consistent with real wage analysis covering the peak inflation period of 2021 through 2022, when real wage growth turned negative. By 2024, real wage growth had returned to positive territory. The figure is real, but it describes a specific window, not a 4-year average. Asked by Arrington whether the country is in the golden age, Bessent answered carefully. Relative to the dark ages that we were thrust in by these failed policies, we are at the dawn of a golden age, he said. Wages are up, take-home pay is up, GDP, as you said, is 2.6%. The figure is real. Bureau of Economic Analysis data shows the quarterly GDP growth rate at 2.6% or higher in recent quarters. The golden age framing is a political characterization. The growth rate is an empirical fact. Both belong in the record, but distinguishing them matters. Arrington tied the growth figure to legislation. That is a percent over what the Congressional Budget Office said after we passed the big beautiful bill, he said. The bill in question is the major tax and spending package passed by the current Republican majority. The CBO's growth projections after that legislation were in fact higher than its pre-legislation baseline. Whether the growth itself can be attributed to the bill or to other factors that the CBO was also revising is a separate question that the CBO's own published methodology addresses cautiously. Arrington gave the bill the credit. The CBO is more reserved. Arrington made a specific deficit claim. The deficit was reduced over 10% in the first 6 months of this fiscal year compared to last fiscal year, he said. Treasury Department monthly statements track this. The reduction figure depends on which baseline and which months you compare. Different framings yield different numbers, all of them in the public record. Arrington also attributed the reduction to discretionary spending control and to having saved up to now almost $500 billion. The total federal budget remains overwhelmingly weighted toward mandatory spending, where the discretionary controls he cited have limited reach. We had quadruple revenue from having restructured World Trade Order, Arrington said. Tariff revenue has in fact increased substantially under the current tariff regime. Treasury and Customs and Border Protection both publish monthly receipts data that allow the comparison. The relevant policy question, which Arrington did not engage in this 5 minutes, is who pays the tariff revenue. Economic analysis generally finds that import tariffs are paid by domestic importers and passed along to domestic consumers. Quadrupling tariff revenue means quadrupling that pass-through cost. The revenue is real. The incidence is the policy story. How many Americans applied for no tax on tips, no tax on overtime, reduced taxes on Social Security, and deductibility of auto loans, Arrington asked. The provisions are part of the major Republican tax and spending package. He provided figures: 7.5 million for no tax on tips, 29 million for overtime, 35 million seniors. The participation numbers are sourced from administration data and Treasury Department analysis. They describe how many people are using the provisions. They do not by themselves describe whether the provisions are revenue positive, revenue neutral, or revenue negative for the federal government. That is the next analytical step. Mr. Arrington, your time has expired, the chair said. Arrington's response was direct, unbelievable. Keep up the good work, Mr. Secretary. Thank you. The moment is the cleanest summary of the speech's posture. The 5 minutes were not a question session for the Treasury Secretary. They were a structured endorsement of the Secretary's position, delivered through a series of rhetorical questions whose answers were already provided. That is allowed within committee procedure. It is also worth naming as what it was. What the 5 minutes actually did was provide a structured partisan endorsement of the current administration's economic posture. That is a legitimate use of committee floor time within the rules of the chamber. Members of both parties use their time this way regularly. Naming the move accurately is the first step in reading it well. Arrington was not probing the Secretary's positions. He was providing the Secretary a platform to confirm them with a sequence of rhetorical setups timed to the 5-minute clock. The form is performance. The function is communication to the members' political base. Clean partisan performances at committee become reference material for both sides. Republican communications operations will cut this 5 minutes into 10 and 15-second clips to demonstrate fluency in the current talking points. Democratic communications operations will cut the same 5 minutes into similar clips to demonstrate the members' rhetorical posture. Academic writing on partisan polarization will use exchanges like this one as examples of the structural drift in committee procedure away from cross-examination and toward platform sharing. The 5 minutes are in the formal congressional record. They will be used. So the final accountability question is the standard one. What was gained, what was lost, and who is paying the cost? What Arrington's constituents gained is 5 minutes of a member of Congress delivering political content tailored to their priors. What the broader chamber lost is 5 minutes of substantive cross-examination of a senior Treasury official by an experienced committee member. The cost is paid by the institutional muscle of the committee process itself, which weakens incrementally each time a 5-minute window is used this way by members of either party. The chamber can act. The public can decide what kind of committee process it wants its tax dollars supporting.